Today I'm going to teach you how to make a website responsive so we can actually have it fit into different devices such as mobile phones, tablets, browsers, so that it actually scales and resizes according to the device you're sitting on. The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to making a responsive website is whether or not to make it for mobile first or for browser first when it comes to the overall design as you get started. So far, when it comes to the website we've been building in these lessons here up until now, we have kind of been making our website to fit the browser first. We haven't taken any sort of mobile device into consideration, and usually the rule of thumb when you make a website is to always design for mobile first. So most people will tell you the rule of thumb is to make it for mobile first, and then you go into a browser responsive website. That being said, this isn't a fixed rule or anything that you have to follow. You can very easily, if you want to, just make a browser version of the website first and scale it down to a mobile device. There's no rules about this is how I need to do it. It's just kind of like a recommendation because it is a little bit easier to size it from mobile to browser. As you're also going to see in the next video, we're going to talk about how to make our current website that we've been making up until now into a mobile version, and it is very easy to do so. So like I said, it's very possible to just make a browser website into a mobile device website very easily, and it's not really something you have to be too worried about if you haven't been doing that up until now. So before we get into actually making any sort of media queries, let's talk a bit about my example that I have in front of me here, because this is not the website we've been building up until now. This is a very short example where I have just the default things that we need to have. So we have all the style sheets, the research style sheet, the main, the index.css. We also have, all the different things we need to have inside the head tag. But inside the body tag, you can see I just have a basic div that has a class set to wrapper-main. So this is going to be a wrapper that makes sure that all my content is aligned the same way inside my website. And I have a basic h1, a paragraph, and a anchor tag inside the website. But I just basically went and gave them just basic styling. So saving this and going inside the website, you can see that everything looks like this. Now, what you will notice is that inside my wrapper, I decided to give this one a fixed pixel width. And that is something that is going to be very important to talk about when it comes to responsive web design. Using fixed pixels is something that you have to be very aware of. So any sort of elements inside your website that you use pixels on, as soon as you get down to a mobile device, this is most likely going to have to get turned into a percentage amount. Because if I were to go inside my browser and actually scale this browser down, you'll notice that as soon as everything gets so small that it can't fit inside the browser anymore, all of a sudden it starts disappearing out on the right side, and we can actually scroll at the bottom here. You can see we can actually scroll to see all the things inside the website, which means that if I were to check this out on a mobile device, which you can actually do by right-clicking, because the browser has a built-in tool to actually allow for you to see this as a mobile device. So if you were to click inspect, go inside, you can see we have this little button up in the top here, which is a toggle device toolbar. If I were to click this one, you can see that all of a sudden we can see this device view. Right now I have mine set to an iPhone 13 Pro, which is one that I actually made myself. I'll show you how to do that as well. But right now you can see we have all these different dimensions we can choose from. So if you want to see it from an iPad, then you can do that. If you want to see it from a iPhone SE, then you can do that as well. So depending on the device that you want to view this from, you can see it inside these different measurements here. Like I said, I have my own custom device, which is set to my current cell phone. So if I were to go inside here, you can go down to edit, click edit, and in here, you can go ahead and add a custom device. So I can click add custom device, give it a name for the cell phone that you might have in front of you, because we all have different cell phones. So if you want to develop for your particular cell phone first, then you can do that in here. And then you can give it a device ratio. So you can give it a width and a height. After doing that, you just click add, and then you make sure to toggle it on in here so you actually have it toggled. Because once you toggle it, it is going to allow for you to go inside your dimensions up here and pick your custom layout. So doing that is going to allow for you to see your particular device inside the browser. In some cases, things might mess up a little bit for you though when you start, swapping devices inside the dimension here. Like it might not look like how it's supposed to, and you might not be able to scroll or anything like that if you're supposed to. So a recommendation after you swap to a certain device, for example, the new custom layout we just created, close it down and then go ahead and right click again and then inspect, because then everything is, as you can see, this is how it's supposed to look like. So just make sure you close things down after changing dimensions and opening it up again. So in here you can see we have a mobile version of our website, and you can actually see that, oh, we have scrolling things going on, which is not supposed to happen on a mobile device, because on a mobile device we only want to scroll down. We don't want to scroll sideways. So having a wrapper that has a fixed pixel amount as a width is not going to work out as soon as you start getting down to a cell phone. What you actually want to do is to go inside your HTML and CSS, and instead of giving it a fixed width set to, for example, 1000 pixels, is you want to set it to something like 100%. If you do that, go inside the browser, refresh it, you can now see that everything is fitting according to my device because it is 100% of my width. So making for mobile devices and tablets and that kind of thing, you start to, focusing on percentages instead of fixed pixels. But as soon as you get into a browser, you see all of a sudden the wrapper is going all the way to the side, and we don't want that because there's a point to having a wrapper. We don't want this to happen. So in this case, you would be using a fixed pixel amount, which is 1000 pixels. So now let's actually go and talk about how to resize things, because if I were to go inside my CSS file, let's go inside the main.css here. I can go down to the very bottom and I can start creating a piece of styling that says, okay, as soon as we scale down the browser to a certain amount, change all the CSS into this new CSS that we have down here. That's basically what we can do. And in order for this to actually work, because if I were to go in and actually create a media query, so we say at media, and then we can actually just go and say curly brackets here. In order for this to actually work, we need to have a very important thing inside our head tag inside the index file, which is this one meta tag that we included at the very beginning in one of the first episodes in this course here, which is the viewport. Now inside this meta tag, you can see we have a couple of things. First of all, we have the name attribute that simply says this is for the viewport of the device. Then we have a content that actually goes in and gives it a couple of rules to follow. For example, with the width equal to device width, it's going to say that this has to fix to the device specific device that you're sitting on, because the pixel density might not be the same thing on all devices. So it has to fit with the device independent pixels that is on the device. And it's just to kind of make sure everything scales the same. Now we do also have a initial scale, which is basically the zoom level when the user actually visits this particular website on the device. So it looks the same as it would inside the browser, because if I were to actually move this, just to show you how this would look like, if I were to go back inside my browser and refresh it and go back inside the mobile version, you'll actually notice that the elements actually scale down. Like the zoom level is going to zoom down into a smaller version. So when I go in here, you can see, oh, all of a sudden things are not working out, like things are acting weird. And this is actually the same issue we have when we actually start swapping between these different modes up here for the dimensions. And then, having to close things down and then open it up again. Like this is what is getting messed up as soon as we start doing that. So it is important that we also have a initial scale, which makes sure that everything scales appropriately, no matter if we're sitting on a browser on our computer or inside a mobile device. So make sure we swap back and refresh the website so that everything now looks scaled. So as you can see, everything looks the same size. So going inside our main.css, as you can see, we have this media tag that we have down here. You do also need to define a width. And the way you would do that is simply go after the media, write parentheses, and then in here would include a maximum or a minimum width, meaning that if I want this to look a certain size until I reach a certain size, then everything needs to change, then I can do that. So if we were to go in here and say max dash width colon and set this one to, for example, 600 pixels, which is actually one of the major breakpoints that we have when it comes to scaling things inside media queries, then we can do that. And you'll notice if I were to go in and say that we have my wrapper up here, I can take my wrapper styling, go inside the media query, and I want to say that this has to look different once we scale down to a certain minimum width. Now, I know I said minimum width, but it sort of confuses me, because maximum width means that when it is 0, up until 600 pixels, then it is going to have this styling down here. So even though max is bigger than minimum, you have to kind of like reverse it in order to properly understand how that works inside the browser. At least when it comes to me trying to think about it, it sometimes confuses me. So whenever you want things to be working at a certain lower scaling, then you want to be using max width, if that makes sense. So going in here, all I need to do is add the CSS that I want to change. So I don't need to add everything in here. But what I can do is I can change the width of my wrapper. So I can say 100% as soon as I get down to a lower than 600 pixels inside my browser. So if I were to go in here and refresh the website, you'll notice that, oh, everything looks good. To properly test this out, we can actually exit. And what I can do instead is I can actually scale things down. So if we were to drag it over here and start scaling it, you'll notice that when I get below 600 pixels, then it stops doing the weird thing and it scales down to a mobile device. So we get from 100% and then it gets to 1000 pixels when we reach this certain breakpoint here. And this is what we call a major breakpoint, because we need to make sure that we have these major breakpoints that swap between different devices such as cell phones, tablets, PC, whatever, to make sure that the overall layout of our website changes at these specific points. So this right here inside the CSS would actually be our first major breakpoint. So what I can do now is I can say, okay, what about if I get to a little bit larger than 600 pixels? Because as it is right now, as you notice, we do still have a little bit of issues going on here. When we get down to 600, it's fine, but we still have this awkward little like middle point, where it's still kind of clipping out until we get to this point here. So the in-between also has to get fitted to, for example, a tablet device. So what I can do is I can copy paste my media query, paste it down to next line, and instead of max width, I can now say that the minimum width should be 601 pixels. So now we're saying from 601 and upwards, it has to be a certain piece of styling. So by doing this, I can now go in and say that the wrapper should maybe also be 100 pixels here. So we could probably do that if we wanted to. But let's also go ahead and get this on a background color, just so we can see properly what is going on here, because you might not be able to see it. So if I were to again copy this, paste it down, I can now say that the minimum width should be the next major breakpoint. And now there is kind of like a rule of thumb when it comes to these major breakpoints here. So in the next case here, it would actually be 768. Let me actually go and write them down for you so you have them like written down somewhere. So like the first one would be to make sure that everything less than 600 pixels is going to be a certain styling. So in this case here, that would be this one up here, right? The next one is going to be everything above 601 pixels. So we're going to add that in as the next one. Then the next breakpoint is of course 768. Then it's 992 pixels. And then the last one is going to be everything above 1200 pixels. Like these are the typical breakpoints that we have. And of course, you can change these as much as you want. These are just a rule of thumb, like a guideline to go from. Now, I just want to point out here that my wrapper inside my website is set to 1000 pixels right now, if I were to actually scroll up and show you. So right now, if I were to set the last media query to 1000 pixels, I'm actually saying that the wrapper is irrelevant at this point, because in this case, this wrapper here should actually be 1200 pixels. So again, depending on your specific website, you might want to change the last piece of scaling when it comes to the media queries. It's just a guideline. It's not a, you gotta do it this way sort of thing. So in my particular example here, I might not want to do 1200 pixels. I might want to do 1000 pixels instead. So what I could do is I could actually go ahead and jump down to the next line, and I can create one, let's say 992. And that is automatically also going to fit in with my 1000 pixel wrapper. So this would actually be perfectly fine in my case here. I don't need a 1200 one. But just so you have them all, like these are the default ones you should go for. So I'm just going to copy paste this down at the bottom here. So you can see what the rule of thumb is when it comes to all the different scalings of the media queries. So let's say in this case here, when we get to 768, instead of having it as red, I could make this one green. I can make the next one purple. And by doing this, I can go inside my website, refresh it, and you'll actually notice that when we start scaling down and get to certain sizes, it is going to change in color depending on where we get to. Of course, when we get down to the cell phone version, we don't have a color because we didn't actually set that inside the minimum width. But you can actually see that things change when we start scaling things inside this this browser here. However, there is also a couple more things that you need to know about when it comes to media queries, because this is just like the basics. If I take the first media query here, we do also have something called only screen, and which is not something that is required in order for this to work. As you can see, everything worked perfectly fine inside the browser. But let's say you have a user who for some weird reason decided that they are still living back in the 90s or something like that, and they're using the old version of Internet Explorer and they want to see a website. Now, if that happens, then these media queries are not going to be supported, which means that everything is going to start looking weird inside their website, because remember what I said, typically we want to make sure we make everything for mobile first, and then inside the media queries, we change it up to a browser version in the very last one down here. So if a person with an older browser that doesn't support these media queries were to watch your browser, then all of a sudden it's not going to work. Essentially, they would be seeing the mobile version inside a browser-sized browser, and that is not what we want them to do. So to make sure that you add in only screen and, it's just kind of like a safety thing to make sure that older browsers is not going to get messed up once they start using these media queries here. Now, these are pretty much what you need in order to just sort of get started making media queries and responsive websites. But I do also want to share a couple more things when it comes to media queries that you might be interested in. So for example, if I want to make sure that some of this styling only works in landscape mode, so if I were to have my cell phone and it's like this in my hand, but if I were to flip it, then things are going to start changing. So you might have some styling that you want to change depending on landscape or portrait mode. So what you can do here is you can go in and say that, okay, for the minimum width here, let's actually go and give this one a background color as well. So let's say that if I'm on a cell phone, everything should turn orange, just to give it some kind of color. What I can also do is I can go inside the media query and say, and I also want this to only do it if we are in a certain orientation. So if the orientation of the cell phone is in landscape mode, then I want this to be happening. All these changes inside this media query should only happen in this particular one. So going inside the browser, if I were to refresh this, you can see that, oh, all of a sudden we don't have any sort of the media query styling happening. That's weird. Well, that's because we changed it to landscape mode, so it's not working in portrait mode. We can actually change this by going in here, and there should be a flip function. As you can see, there's a tiny button over here that says rotate. So if I were to rotate, all of a sudden you can see that things are changing in here. Now, of course, just like before, we do need to close it down, open it back up again, and now I can see everything is working properly. Because as soon as you start changing dimensions or you start rotating it, you need to make sure you close it down and open it up again. It's just kind of like a weird thing the browser has. But in this case, you can see everything is working in landscape mode, but it's not working in portrait mode. Once we do that, like nothing is getting applied. So if you have individual styling for portrait or landscape mode, you of course do want to make sure you have one for landscape and you have one for portrait. So if I were to say portrait in this one here, and let's say you want to change the color to blue, just to have something else, then we can go back inside the browser, refresh it, and then you can see everything is blue inside portrait mode. But if I were to flip it, everything turns green. Now I just went ahead and deleted everything, so we're back to just having a max width set to 600 pixels without landscape or portrait. And the next thing I want to show you here is how to create a minimum width and a maximum width. So let's say I want to do a certain thing in between a certain piece of styling. So instead of doing all these down here, what I could write instead is, for example, to say I want to include 2 pieces of styling. So basically I want this red color here to work as long as we're in between 601 pixels going up, so and a maximum width of 768 pixels. I can also do this. So I'm just going to go and delete everything so we only have the minimum width and as well as the new one we just created here. So basically when I'm in between these 2 measurements, this is going to apply this piece of styling. So if I were to go back inside my website, refresh it, you can now see that when I start scaling, it is going to change the color when I'm in between a certain amount. So now it turns red, but as soon as I get down to here, it starts changing again. So, it's only in between these 2 different measurements here that is actually applying the styling. So there's many different ways you can customize media queries, but the basics is really that you just need to have these measurements down here. It is very typical for people to have a website that has a wrapper set to 1200 pixels, which is why this is the default one that we have when it comes to the largest of these different media queries, just to mention why this is 1200 pixels. With that said, we do have a website that we've been building for the past many lessons, and we want to make that into a mobile version. So, and bright screen incoming here, by the way, I do have a design ready for the website we've been building up until now. So as you can see, this is the website that we have, and this is what we're going to be building in the next lesson. So we're going to take everything and we're going to scale it down into a mobile device to make sure everything looks really good. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.